Coming up on this edition of the Black Vault Radio, Emmy award-winning producer and cinematographer Mr. Dave Beaty steps into the vault. He recently released the Nimitz Encounters film, racking up millions of views on YouTube. Join us as we explore his film and the 2004 UFO encounters with a U.S. Navy carrier strike group.
He comes down and he's passing through 10,000 feet, gets closer to this thing, and he suddenly realizes that he's looking at something that looks like, he described it like as a tic-tac. This object is turning with this fighter jet, so it's almost an aggressive move, to be honest with you. It was hovering at their cap point, which is a classified piece of real estate in the sky that no one really should know about. This object seemed to know where that is. Their commanding officer arrived with a couple U.S. Air Force officers and told them to, retrieve those RMCs from the safe and, to sign them out to the CO. And these guys basically took them and left.
All that and much more. So stay tuned. The Black Vault Radio is about to begin. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey, my quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is the Black Vault Radio. I am your host, John Greenewald Jr. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and making this your podcast and radio show of choice. I know there are all sorts of choices out there for you to listen to, so I do appreciate you tuning in to this one. It's going to be a fun show, actually. Mr. Dave Beaty is coming up. If you're not familiar with him, he just launched a film that he has spent a lot of time and a lot of energy, and let me tell you, he has put in a lot of his skill, and he has a lot of it into this film called the Nimitz Encounters. Now, if you are unfamiliar with it, in 2004, this was the UFO incident in which the USS Nimitz carrier group had encountered quite a few UFOs, and this is known as the Tic Tac incident. I'm going to bring Dave on so he can talk about not only the film, but the incident itself. It's one that I haven't spent a whole lot of time researching, although I am familiar with the overall scope of it. So it's going to be fun to kind of pick his brain a little bit and figure out exactly what some of the witnesses are saying. Because again, the UFO field is so vast. It is so hard to keep focus on every single case that has been a hot topic of discussion. The Nimitz is obviously one of them. So Dave Beaty is going to come on and talk about his film and the case itself. Now, a couple things to deal with here before we get going with Dave. Now, it has been a very, very interesting, exciting, frustrating, overwhelming couple weeks in the field of ufology. Now, for those who have missed it, on June 1st, about 2 weeks ago, there was a article that was dropped in a newspaper called The Intercept. Now, this is the one that Glenn Greenewald, and no, there is no relation there. His name is spelled different. Glenn Greenewald launched quite a few years ago, and he's the one connected with the Edward Snowden leaks and so on and so forth. Now, regardless of what you feel about all of that, because I have been outspoken about some of those leaked documents and so on, it's a very hard-hitting news agency. They deal with hard-hitting news pieces. They'll tackle things that not many other agencies will. But it's reputable in the sense that they do their homework. They do a lot of background and fact-checking and stuff like that. Now, June 1st, the Intercept had dropped an article about Luis Elizondo. Now, Luis Elizondo is the alleged head or director of the ATIP program. That is the one that is largely touted as the Pentagon's secret UFO study. If you listen to this show, you know that I talk about this quite a bit. It's something that's very intriguing to me because it either supports and adds to my 22 plus years of research into the UFO phenomena, and its connection to the U.S. government and military, or quite possibly is not quite what we are led to believe. Now, obviously, I have had quite a few questions along the way, including the story about Mr. Luis Elizondo. There are quite a few articles that you can find. I'll link a few of them in the show notes page if you're not familiar with how to get there. Just go to www.theblackvault.com/show notes, and I'll link over to a couple articles so you can kind of take a look and see what my stance is. I was not always a skeptic about these claims, but as time went on, there were quite a few things that came about that made me kind of scratch my head and go, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't match up, or, that the long history doesn't really support that, or, hey, wait a minute, these guys are contradicting each other, yet they should have their story straight, those types of things. Now, it's not popular to question a very popular topic and a popular person, meaning Mr. Luis Elizondo has a lot of fans out there, a lot of devoted fans out there, people that follow his work and follow his story and believe wholeheartedly about what he is saying. Back to that Intercept article, it surrounded a Pentagon statement that said specifically that Mr. Luis Elizondo had no responsibilities on the ATIP program while he worked within OUSDI. Now, what the heck does that even mean? Well, in short, OUSDI is where Mr. Elizondo claimed that he headed the program. So some really kind of fought back on that Pentagon statement and said, well, he maybe have you worked on it somewhere else. And those that were supporting Mr. Elizondo in this kind of whole debacle, they said, well, there could have been another office. There could have been another this, another that. Well, the problem with that is that goes against Mr. Elizondo's own words. And he said that he led it through this agency. Now, OUSDI is a subcomponent of OSD, or the Office of Secretary of Defense. Now, it's very convoluted and a little bit confusing, but under OSD, there's over 30 components. OUSDI is one of them. So again, you can really make the excuse all day long until your face turns blue that maybe he works somewhere else, but you have to discount the words of Mr. Elizondo to do that. So whether or not that works for somebody out there, that's fine. But I go with that's what Mr. Elizondo claimed. So the Pentagon essentially fired the shot across the bow, saying, no, he had no responsibilities. Now, I will be blatantly honest with you and say I did not believe that statement when I first heard about it. I thought, no, and contrary to some of the online trolls, no, I did not get this statement myself, although I did verify it was real and have since received it. But at the time, I just thought, okay, there's no way that this could be a legitimate statement. And sure enough, it actually was. Now, here we are 2 weeks later, and that article at The Intercept, written by a journalist by the name of Keith Clore, has become under fire. I mean, this is controversy to the nth degree on whether or not that Pentagon statement holds water or does not. Now, again, contrary to what the online trolls want you to believe, I'm not here to say that the Pentagon is 100% right here. I never have said that. But what I have said is we are 100% deserving of a response. The Pentagon has not only issued that particular statement, but fast forward to yesterday, again, just under 2 weeks from the Intercept's article, I've been communicating with the Pentagon for one reason and one reason only, that the biggest supporters of Mr. Elizondo have touted a 2009 leaked Harry Reid memorandum about ATIP. This was reported last year by George Knapp and had names at the bottom, what is called attachment A of this particular document. Names that Harry Reid wanted to have involved in a special access program status for ATIP. Now, the letter itself goes into much greater detail. I'll link to that as well so you can see it. but it was leaked to George Knapp, who published it. Those names that were involved in the program had Mr. Elizondo allegedly underneath the black and Dr. Hal Puthoff underneath the black. For whatever mysterious reason, George Knapp or KLAS-TV, the station where he works, or his source, told him to redact those names. Now, why? It was already well established. Now, the problem also with this letter that I immediately had asked Mr. Knapp on Twitter and some other journalists, including Brian Bender from Politico, hey, how could you use this letter if it predates by at least 5 months Mr. Elizondo's claim? Well, I never got a response to that. So I went to the Pentagon. I handed them this letter, well, virtually that is. I didn't physically go there. But I went to the Pentagon and said, okay, look, this is the evidence that's being touted. Mr. Elizondo's completely silent as of the recording of this. And said, does this prove anything? Does this change your statement? And I waited, and it took a little while to get them to respond. Admittedly, I'm kind of a nobody, so they're not going to drop everything and go, oh, got to get back to Greenewald. Although some of the trolls might make you think that I'm, in cahoots with the Pentagon, which I think is hilarious. Quite a show of desperation by some self-proclaimed journalists that have made that claim, which is laughable. But that being said, they're pretty busy. They've got a lot of people to deal with, a lot of people shooting them questions, a lot of topics. It's not like the employment of Mr. Elizondo is on the top of their list. I would imagine there's many more pressing issues than that. And so when they got back to me, to my surprise, not only did they authenticate the letter, I was imagining at that moment when I read, that they authenticated the letter, said that it was genuine. The next line, I thought they were going to say, we're issuing a new statement. This does change things. To my surprise, no, they didn't. And in fact, they essentially doubled down. They said that the existence of that changes nothing. That, to me, I think is incredibly interesting. True or not, those that are touting this letter just got it blown out of the water on an official level. Again, I'm not saying the Pentagon is, dishing out gospel here. I've proven previous statements throughout the decades wrong. So let's kind of sit down and analyze this. This is what they said. Let me go ahead and read it to you because I want to make sure I get it right. She says, I can confirm, and this is Susan Go. This is a Pentagon spokesperson. Anybody can verify that. She says, I can confirm that the memo you're referring to is authentic. Now, that would be the 2009 memorandum from Senator Harry Reid that I just talked about. She said that they received the letter. She said DOD received it and responded to Senator Reid. However, she then explained to me that she cannot give out congressional correspondence. That's part of her limitation in the Public Affairs Office. They don't give that out. And that's fair. I've actually heard that before. I do have open FOIA requests for the letter itself, even though now it's irrelevant. It's obviously told to be authentic, but also the response to Senator Reid. So hopefully that will, one day present itself. Who knows how long? But she continues, and this is a quote. It makes no change to previous statements. Mr. Elizondo had no assigned responsibilities for ATIP while he was in OUSDI. DIA, or Defense Intelligence Agency, administered ATIP, and Elizondo was never assigned to DIA. Elizondo did interact with the DIA office managing the program while the program was still ongoing, but he did not lead it. Now that's interesting because obviously he has to have provenance of some of the information because, let's face it, he knew about ATIP, he knew some details. So I think it's silly for anybody to think he didn't have some kind of connection to it, whatever that might have been. But a connection or even working on it is not really the issue here. Again, contrary to what most trolls want you to believe online that are throwing their attacks my direction. The question here is about the claim of being the director of it, continuing it well after the funding was pulled. He, meaning Mr. Elizondo even said in 2012 the funding was pulled. So now all of a sudden, all of those claims get thrown into question here. And this second Pentagon statement, again, takes it a step farther and says, yes, we acknowledge that 2009 letter. We're not hiding behind anything saying that it's fraudulent, and it changes nothing. So the ball at this point is not in the Pentagon's court or my court or Keith Clor's court or the Intercept's court or anyone. It doesn't really matter about what we think. It matters between Mr. Elizondo and his former employer. That's what matters. And I just think that it's incredibly important that he chimes in. And if there is evidence, he does not deserve this and should present it. I put an open offer out there to Dr. Hal Puthoff, Mr. Elizondo himself. I reached out to him. I do know the email address that I have for him is valid. I reached out to some of the journalists, so on and so forth. And yet no one took me up on my offer that said I would help them disseminate the information if I could verify it. But I said I would help them disseminate it. No critique, no spin, no comment, other than this is the evidence. Mr. Elizondo did lead the program. Let's put that to bed and deal with the many other questions that I, brought up. Sadly, no one took me up on that, and that's fine. But in the grander picture, they should come forward with something, and they have yet to do it. Now, I'm thinking about doing a much larger full episode about some of this. There is so much information. But in the show notes, I'll go ahead and link you to the most recent article. It is very interesting. There's a lot of details there that I didn't just go over. But I at least wanted to kind of update you, since it's been a few weeks since I've done a show, on what has transpired just in the last 2 weeks. Very quickly, before we get to Dave Beaty, I'm excited to also announce the reason why it's been a couple weeks since a show. I've been working on setting up equipment here to do not only some live streams. I know I teased that a little bit last year. Yes, it took me a little bit. I do have a newborn daughter, and she has kind of taken over schedule-wise on any free time. So a little bit slow going, so I apologize for that. But I spent a lot of time setting up some equipment here and some equipment that will allow me to not only do the live stream, but also actually take phone calls, have you guys have a toll-free line to call in, and maybe start doing some of these interviews with video. So I'm excited about that. It takes a little bit of time, obviously. It's not as easy as it sounds when you have multiple telephone lines and stuff like that. So I'm still kind of figuring that out a little bit and fine-tuning it. But subscribe to that YouTube channel that you'll find a link to on the Black Vault, because I have actually done a random live stream just to kind of say hi to everybody. And quite a few people came in. I deleted that video, but again, it's just kind of a random test, and I will need your help to kind of figure all of that out. That being said, I know that was kind of a long little intro, but at least now you're up to date. Check out all of those links on the show notes page. Mr. Dave Beaty is coming up right after this quick break. Stay tuned. On this episode's TBV Dialogue segment, I welcome Emmy award-winning producer and cinematographer Dave Beaty. Along with a successful production career, Dave is a UFO researcher and a journalist. His career in nonfiction television and documentary spans 25 years, and highlights include national programs on Travel Channel, History Channel, and PBS, and many more. Most recently, his UFO documentary film, The Nimitz Encounters, has received over 1.3 million views since May of 2019. The public benefit release of the Nimitz Encounter film features a culmination of Dave's extensive use of 3D computer animation and graphics, as well as an electronic music and sound design. The raw files can be downloaded on my site, The Black Vault, for your own personal collection, and I highly recommend you grab a copy and watch it. Let me welcome to the show, Mr. Dave Beaty.
Hey, thanks. Great to be here, John.
Well, I appreciate your time. You have obviously been very much in the forefront of many discussions as of late with your really amazing documentary film. I believe you call it a short, but it's about, 30 plus minutes, correct?
Yeah, that's right. This version of it, the first one was like about 15, which would traditionally be a short, but it's getting a little bit longer as I keep adding more to it. So,
and it's really well done. I highly recommend everyone to go take a look. I have added direct links to the film. You can visit the show notes page if you don't know how to get there. It's www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Just look for this episode, and I will link you right over to all of the pertinent files and links to Dave's site, etc. But Dave, like I like to do with all of the guests when they appear for the first time, if you could give me just a little bit of background before we get into that film about your, work history, your interest in UFOs, and essentially just kind of pave the way for me on how you started making this film and why you wanted to do it.
Yeah, sure. Going back to, when I first started in television, I was always sort of interested in UFOs. My career took me into the broadcast journalism field for about 10 years, where I started in small market television in upstate New York. And then I kind of got sick of the cold weathers up there in the Northeast and came down to Florida and continued my news career down here in the Fort Myers, Florida market. While, back then when I came in the 90s, I got involved in the Mutual UFO Network as a field investigator, and I did that for several years. There wasn't a lot going on here at that time, but my mom lived up in Gulf Breeze, so that always kind of was an interest of mine, that case. I did do some sky watching up there. I never saw anything. My mom did, though. She said she saw the red light UFO that they used to call Bubba when she was living there. So that, I did have an interest going back. I never really combined the film part, though, with the UFO part until recently, because all of the other films that I've been doing in television production after I got out of news have been, mostly corporate production and then nonfiction television, as you kind of mentioned in your intro there. Like currently I'm involved doing World War II documentary films, which is taking up all my time. I'm currently working on one about Admiral Yamamoto of the Japanese Navy, which is going to be, I guess that's going to be released next September. And the current one that's out right now is called D-Day at Pointe du Hoc, which is the story of the 2nd Rangers assault on the cliffs in Normandy, France. So,
wow. Right up my alley. I love that. That's awesome. Well, good luck with all of that. To your film about the Nimitz Encounters, obviously, for those that aren't aware, this was a UFO incident that is making quite a few headlines, not only in the last year and a half or so, but very recently with the launch of the History Channel show Unidentified and them recreating it. I'm going to be honest with you. Your rendition of it trumps a huge network recreating this thing. I mean, honestly, you did a fantastic job. It's very hard for me to say that to people about production because I am a very tough critic, but you did a great job. I have to ask just about doing this on your own. That's got to cost a lot of money, right? Like, how did you fund this and start creating this this film for yourself?
Well, it could cost a lot of money, and a lot of television production does. If you're charging the client or the production entity is commissioned to do a show, for instance, with History Channel, which I've done a few of those, actually, one of the shows I did for History Channel was called "The Nazi Plan to Bomb New York," and it featured extensive use of 3D recreation of all those aircraft and air machines, which is sort of interesting that the one that's on now on the History Channel is the same kind of topics that I'm doing with the Nimitz Encounters. I think it was episode 1 and 2. I have a certain skill set and I have access to the computer systems. Nowadays, the home PCs and towers and stuff can do incredible graphics, could do full, feature film, Hollywood style editing and audio. And so, the tool sets are available to pretty much anybody. And it comes down to putting in the time and the effort. I probably spent nearly a year doing those 3D animations on my off time. Because again, the Nimitz Encounters wasn't part of my day job. It was something I was doing, on the weekends, at night, rendering overnight, to create the 3D graphics. And then, I enlisted the help of my friends to do some of the voiceovers. And, the narrator, Bob Height, he's a longtime retired newscaster from the Tampa market. And he just has a great voice, classic, broadcast voice. So, by pulling all these elements together and then just putting in that time, that sweat equity over almost a year, and, combining that with my background and then also the journalistic side of it, I was able to do it very, very inexpensively. I mean, the only hard costs I had, it might have been some of the music and a couple of the models that, I didn't do the entire modeling of, like the F-18, that was a base model that I purchased. Actually, somebody, helped me with the cost of that. And then, I just modified all the textures of it to create the Black Aces version of that Super Hornet. So, I don't know if I had to calculate it, the out of pockets might have been several $100s,
That's crazy to me. I mean, I don't know if you know a lot about my background, but I produce a lot for like A&E networks and various cable shows. And I contract guys like you. And if you only charged me, not you personally, but if CG artists only charged me a couple $100, I'd be ecstatic. You know what I mean?
Well, you got to realize,
for 30-minute piece.
I'm not counting all the hours that I put into it. So it depends on my hourly rate. Yeah,
no, I gotcha. But your skill set definitely shines through with the movie. But my point with that is your skills are so valuable to people like me who don't have that skill. And when we make documentaries and stuff like that for History Channel, I'm here to tell the audience, Dave, you know this, but for the audience, you pay like literally thousands of dollars for clips that may only be 5 to 10 seconds long. Right. I mean,
absolutely.
It's insane.
I mean, one of the reasons why the History Channel Unidentified show doesn't have CGI that you might see in my film is, to be honest with you, I'm sure they didn't have the time nor the budget to produce it, because, you're talking, if you just had like 1 or 2 minutes of 3D animation, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars, so, there's that. It
definitely comes down to a budget thing. So kudos on that. Give the audience a little bit of a breakdown. I know there is so much to the Nimitz case in 2004, but my audience may not be looking into a lot of this stuff like some of us that really have the keen interest. So take a couple minutes and just kind of give a brief overview of the encounter. Obviously, you recount it in much more detail in the film, but give them an idea of what happened.
Yeah, sure. A lot of this wasn't even out in the public until a year or two ago, even though the event occurred in 2004, in November of 2004. Many people, even that were studying UFOs, hadn't heard of this. But around 2017, this began to kind of leak out, and then we found other references to it before that. But the basic story is the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was doing routine training off San Diego, probably about 90 miles, west of San Diego, in a training area there, an operations area. And they do these trainings before they're deployed overseas. For instance, obviously the Gulf Wars were going on around that time. And so they were they were doing workups, real world sort of simulations and training exercises, air defense training, and also, the ships, the crews were training their battle stations and the whole thing for several weeks that November. And while they were out there, the USS Princeton, who's a guided missile cruiser, began picking up radar targets that were sort of unknown aircraft. And they couldn't really explain it because these unknown aircraft were coming down from high altitudes, above 80,000 feet. And the senior chief, who is kind of like the operational specialist that was overseeing the radar men, noticed that these things were going very slow. So they might come down to 28,000 feet and they might be traveling at like around 100 knots, which is highly unusual to be at that flight level traveling that slow. Most aircraft are jets at that aircraft or at that altitude. So it was strange. And the next thing that happened is they began doing recalibrations of their Spy-1 radar system. It's a phased array radar system, one of the most advanced radars that we have. It shouldn't be picking up false targets or radar clutter, that sort of thing. So they took the system down and brought it back up and did the recalibrations. But what happened was that the tracks became even clearer and more distinct. So they really were definitely tracking objects that were up there. They knew that coming up in a few days, they were going to be doing an air defense exercise where they would be launching the airplanes off the Nimitz. And so coming up to that day, the senior chief briefed the captain and convinced him that they needed to go identify one of these objects to see what they were, because he was concerned with flight safety that they would be operating around the same altitudes doing their simulated training. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to run into anything that's up there. If it was, for instance, some type of balloon or civilian aircraft or something. And again, he was seeing these almost on a daily basis from around November 10th. Sometimes he would see 4 to 5, 5 to 10 in a group of targets. So it wasn't just one object. It was like several objects traveling south. Normally, he would pick these things up around San Clemente, Catalina Islands. Mm-hmm. That's where they would first observe these on the radar. So on the 14th, they began launching Super Hornets that were going to be conducting functional check flights and begin doing simulated air defense exercises where they pair off against each other and practice dogfighting skills and so on. And then they launched the E-2 Hawkeyes that provide sort of the air traffic control in the sky with their big rotating radar dish above the prop E-2. They get up above the fight, and then they do the controlling of all the jets. So that morning, when Fast Eagle flight, they were from the Black Aces fighter attack squadron. They were some of the first jets off the Nimitz, and the USS Princeton contacted the E-2 and took control of a couple of the jets and vectored them to the coordinates of one of these targets that was unknown, around 24,000 feet, traveling at about 100 knots. So Fast Eagle takes off about 40 miles away to this target. And around the same time, one of the other jets that was up there heard this on the radio. He, too, began going to that coordinate in the sky. And on the way, the Princeton called them and asked about weapons. They were curious if the jets had any loadout, which they didn't, because they were doing training and they don't carry live missiles and ordnance during training operations, which I found out. Mm-hmm. And initially, for the longest time when I heard that, I always thought that they were like hoping they did have some weapons in case it was like a terrorist or something, But Kevin Day, the senior chief, told me that no, they were more concerned that they didn't want to be shooting anything. They didn't want these jets to have any ordnance because they didn't know what they were going to encounter. Mm-hmm. So again, I'm not totally sure, but that's what Kevin told me. So anyways, the first jet arrives, and this guy was named Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Kurth. He arrives at that location. He doesn't see anything on his radar and doesn't see anything at 24,000 feet, but he notices a disturbance on the ocean surface, and he described it as like a whitewater disturbance, maybe several hundred feet or several hundred meters big. And so he's kind of checking that out, trying to figure out what's causing that disturbance in the water, just something odd. And around that time, the Fast Eagle, the pair of jets from the Black Aces arrive. So he's called off and sent back to the Nimitz. And the two jets, begin vectoring towards the same position. They too don't see any contact at 24,000 feet. There's nothing on the radar, and it seems not to be there. And they notice this whitewater patch as well. The lead guy, Commander Dave Fravor, described it as kind of like what it would look like if there was something under the water, like even if it was, he said it was like a seamount, like a undersea mountain that's just below, or a reef or something with water kind of breaking over it. And he also has said that it kind of looked like what you might think of a 737, about that size, 10 feet under the water. I'm not totally clear if that's the shape that he saw, or he's just using that as a reference, kind of the size. So he's looking at it, and about that time, he notices, or his backseater notices, this white object moving around erratically above that white water. So maybe 50 feet in the air above this. And you have to remember, if they're at 20,000 feet looking down at the surface of the ocean of something that's the size of 737, it's going to be very, very small. Think of, like, if you're standing up, if you dropped a dime on the floor or something, it's just that little spot of water down there. They see this movement, and they're like, hey, do you see that object? And it's very odd in its movement. He said it was kind of moving around like a ping pong ball or something just above that white water, sort of like it was checking it out. And about this time, he peels off and begins descending. That he's going to, go check out this object, and he puts his wingman's jet into covering, position, so that it's sort of like an overwatch position. The second jet, the wingman, stays at altitude while he goes down to check out the target that he sees down there. It's my understanding that he still didn't have any radar contact on anything. And throughout the whole engagement, it's been reported that none of these fighter jets were able to acquire any radar targets. It was always vectored from the Princeton. So he comes down, and he's passing through 10,000 feet, gets closer to this thing, and he suddenly realizes that he's looking at something that looks like, he describes it like as a Tic Tac, a sort of capsule-shaped, thing that's white, almost porcelain white, with no windows, no wings, no jet exhaust coming off it. It's just this like capsule thing, and it's probably about 40 to 50 feet long. And obviously he's trying to figure out what it is. It doesn't seem to have any, flight control surfaces, doesn't seem to have any, type of propulsion that's obvious. But yet this thing is moving around. So he begins circling around the object from, again, like around, I think he was around 8,000 feet, and this thing is down on the surface. Like, at some point in this turn, he said that the object seemed to become aware of the presence of his jet, and begins coming up from 50 feet or so. So he says that he begins doing this turn, and this object's coming up, and begins mirroring the turn of his F-A-18. And they're about a mile apart in the sky, doing this turning circle, which in itself is pretty interesting, because really with fighter jets and intercepts, you're trying to get on the tail of your opponent. When you do the merge at an intercept, you're trying to get around to get on the tail of the opponent, so you can shoot them down. Mm-hmm. And this object is turning with this fighter jet, so it's almost an aggressive move, to be honest with you, from what my understanding. At some point, he's about a mile away, and they're coming around the circle, and they get halfway around the circle. He executes a diving turn to pull his nose on this object. They try to get their nose ahead of their opponent so that they can bring themselves around on the tail of their opponent. This object turns about that time and shoots away at like hypersonic speed. And all four aircrew that are there see this object take off and shoot across the horizon, and it's gone. And they're just kind of left there like, what just happened? It's a question that they simply can't answer, because none of them could recognize what this object was. And none of them really could compare it to any known aircraft that they had ever seen that could actually execute these kind of turning maneuvers and take off at that, excessive rate of speed. So they go back to where this whitewater thing was. Now that's gone, and the whitewater has disappeared. So again, they don't know what that is either. About this time, they get a call on the radio from the Princeton, who's been following this on the radio calls and so on. And the controller tells them that, the thing is now at their cap position, which is about 60 miles from where they are. So the object had traveled, according to Princeton, in 60 miles within seconds, and actually it was hovering at their cap point, which is a classified piece of real estate in the sky that no one really should know about. That's like where all the jets kind of loiter after taking off or returning, as they're waiting to be vectored to their missions. So that's a very, sensitive piece of information, and this object seemed to know where that is. And they, when they came back, it was gone. They never reacquired it. They landed on the ship soon thereafter. This whole thing took 5 minutes or something, really, because it wasn't that far from Nimitz. So after they land, they brief the next crew that is about ready to take off from the Black Aces, the next group of FA-18s, and that crew affixes a at-FLIR targeting pod to the outside of the jet, and it's called the ANQ-228 at-FLIR by Raytheon, and it's used for basically attacking targets, either air to ground, or it can be used in air to air in some instances as well. But it has recording capabilities. It can work in electro-optical TV mode and in FLIR mode. So this group takes off, and they're vectored out to the last position. I'm unsure if at this point if Princeton still had a radar lock on it. I'm sure they did. So they're vectored out to this location of this object, and they acquire it with this at-FLIR. They were trying to get a radar lock on the object, and from my understanding, they were unsuccessful. They were able to have their radar sort of pick it up and begin developing a track, but the radar would sort of drop it, and it was unsuccessful in acquiring a lock on. But the at-FLIR in the optical tracking mode, they were able to get a track on this object, and they filmed it for a while. I'm not sure exactly how many miles away that it was, but they never got a eyes-on visual of this white capsule. They just got it on their FLIR targeting pod. That piece of video was like one of the first pieces of evidence of this case that ever made it out into the public around 2007. On the website Above Top Secret, the existence of this case and this video was first revealed to a small number of people knew about it back then. So, fast forward to 2017, this whole story broke in the New York Times, and the group To the Stars, subsequently released like that video, which is called FLIR 1, and several other targeting pod videos of what they said were unknown objects. And that's kind of, the nutshell story of the Nimitz.
It's an amazing story, and your recollection of it and the storytelling of it is based on you literally tracking down a lot of the witnesses or all the witnesses that you could find. Talk to me about who you have tracked down and spoke to, because a lot of them appear in your film.
Yeah, well, going back to the beginning, 2017 with the Times article, there were several documents that were released over time in the beginning of 2018. One of the first was called the Pilot's Report that appeared on To the Stars Academy. And another one, I believe we tracked down based on just doing cross-reference Google searches, was an article by Paco Chirichi, who is a former fighter pilot that was writing for FighterSweep.com. It's sort of an industry blog for fighter pilots or aviation buffs and so on. And, between those two documents, it described the event in some detail, including names of many of the pilots involved. And so what I began doing is trying to reach out to those fighter pilots that were present at the time. In Paco's article, he mentions a female for the first time. He doesn't mention her name, and none of the other reporting that had been done up to that point in, probably around January or February of 2018 had ever mentioned any females. It was always the male pilots. Mm-hmm. So I began reaching out. I reached out to Paco. I reached out to Doug Kurth through LinkedIn. I reached out to Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate, who is also one of the first guys to see this object with Commander Fravor. I reached out to Fravor. That was pretty much it as far as who was known at that time mm-hmm. with the fighter pilots. The other people hadn't come forward. Their names were not out there. So putting these pieces together, I'm like, okay, well, that's a start. I did eventually talk to Jim Slate through LinkedIn, and he, agreed to, answer some questions, and he confirmed that he was in the wingman's jet at the time. He saw this object they called the Tic Tac. I talked to Paco Chirichi, who is good friends with several of the aviators, including Commander Fravor, and he confirmed that, my article is accurate, and there was a female in the flight crew. He's like, you're correct. She just doesn't want to come forward. He said that she was wigged out by the whole thing, and I think she was active duty. So, at that point, I had a pretty good idea of who all the people were. And I told these pilots, I'm like, look, I'm not interested in outing anybody. I just want, if I'm going to do a recreation, because at that point I was beginning kind of formulating a script and how I could do this short. Mm-hmm. I wanted to make sure I was accurate in who was in the planes. And if it's a female pilot in one of the jets, then I should indicate that to the audience. So I've never, ever tried to hassle or bother any of these people that don't want to be, that haven't come forward. In some cases, admitting that you saw a UFO, for instance, sure, can have negative effects. There's a stigma associated with it. Some of these people have clearances. Mm-hmm. They work in government contracting positions, or they're active duty. They don't want to have anything to do with it. So I totally respect that, especially for, military service members and veterans. So using those interviews and the questions that I had answered, and the really, really great articles. Paco's article is so detailed from 2015 in Fighter Sleep. You can search that. You can look that up. It's called There I Was, X-Files Edition. That's one of the best ones ever. Mm-hmm. And, over time, I've kind of communicated with Paco. He's an author. He just has a new book that came out too called Lines of the Sky. If you want to read more about what he's doing these days. Yeah. The other documents, the pilot's report, and then I believe it was in May of 2018 that the executive summary report came out. KLAS and reporter George Knapp released this document that had even greater detail, retelling this event and including statements from all the ships and even the submarine USS Louisville, from the Hawkeye, to the crewmen on the Princeton. Yeah. And it was around that time that Kevin Day first appeared in my world. I have a couple of groups on Facebook, and Kevin Day was invited into our group and basically showed up and told us that he had written a book about it, a fictionalized account called The Sailor's Anthology.
Wrote a book. I'm sorry to interrupt. Wrote a book about the Tic Tac incident. Yeah. Okay.
It has several short stories, but you can find it for free. He released it as a novel that he wrote, and it's again called A Sailor's Anthology. Mm-hmm. Kevin M. Day. And in it, he changes the names and the dates and stuff like that. But it's sort of a recollection of those days. And, USS Princeton as the operations specialist in the Combat Information Center. And the week of November 10th, when these objects appeared, so he, came out and basically said I was there, and he began inviting other veterans into the group. So Gary Voorhees, who is a fire controlman aboard Princeton, also, came into my world, and I began talking to these guys. So the film has, started out, from a newspaper article, and all these great details came out. And at that point, I began editing it, and, fast forward to like November 2018, I just said, I'm just going to pick the anniversary of it. And it was November 14th, 2018. I released the film in its 15-minute version of it. At that point, one of the interviews I had was from To the Stars, because I don't have any budget, so I'm not traveling around the country.
Sure.
To Kevin Day's house in Oregon, or Gary's house in Florida to interview them. I didn't have the resources to do that at that point, but I had reached out to the Stars, who had an interview with Commander Fravor on their website, and I asked if I could use an excerpt of that, and they emailed me back, gave me permission to use a short clip of Commander Fravor. So the first version that I did was around 15 minutes, had his kind of recollection of the story, that I told a little while ago, and over, I don't know, 3-4 months, I had like 1.5 million views of my little recreation.
Incredible. So and that was the first rendition, not even including the at least 1.3 the million that's on now. So that's just the first rendition of this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so with that, obviously, I mean, I'm not the only one that's noticed this, but you've had a couple versions of the film. If you don't mind me asking, you brought up Commander Fravor being involved in that first rendition. You've released this much longer version, and I can't help but notice that Fravor's not in that one. Would you mind me asking what happened?
Yeah, he asked to be removed. That's about all I know. Probably going back to December, I think that I got an email saying, hey, from To the Stars, actually, not from him. He's never contacted me, really. Like I said, I tried to email him, but he never responded to me. And so he went to the Stars Academy and said, hey, this guy's using my interview. I don't want my interview to be used in anything except your website. That's pretty much what they said to me. So, it was kind of disappointing to me, because that meant that I would have to re-edit it, and I wasn't really too sure how he was going to tell the story without his interview. I mean, I can do it. You basically paraphrase a story. You don't have to have an interview, but it certainly
helps.
Yeah. By that time, I had been getting some witnesses that were coming forward. Sorry, that's my phone ringing there.
That's okay.
I had some witnesses that were coming forward via email to me. That's how I first became aware of Patrick Hughes from the USS Nimitz VAW 117 Wallbangers E2 Squadron. And he related a story to me that I hadn't heard before. And that was, he said that, first of all, he had a friend that flew in the Hawkeyes that had confided in him that he too had seen the Tic Tac object during the 8X on November 14, 2004. And he said another odd thing that happened is that after the flight returned, his job was to sort of strip the plane and do maintenance and so on. And one of the things they did was they secured these classified recorders called RMCs, or removable memory cartridges, from the Hawkeyes. And, after the plane lands and the aircrew departs and so on, they would take these hard drives and secure them in a classified, a crypto, like two-sided safe where you needed two combinations to open it. I mean, that's how serious this stuff was. It contained data is still classified today, namely the system itself, called the CEC, or Cooperative Engagement Capability. It's a newer combined radar type display they have. And so this data that's recorded is classified. He said that after they put them back in the safe in their workshop, maybe 30, 40 minutes later, their commanding officer arrived with a couple Air Force officers, U.S. Air Force officers, and told them to, retrieve those RMCs from the safe and, to sign them out to the CO. And these guys basically took them and left. And you have to realize that at that point, Patrick didn't really know anything about a UFO or anything that was out in the ordinary. It was just kind of strange to have his CEO show up, which he had never done before, and take these hard drives. Mm-hmm. He said it just had never happened before. After his friend got back from the flight, he soon found out what was going on. His friend began to tell him about, seeing this unknown object from the Hawk, and also that they had the weirdest debrief they had ever had, where they were told not to talk about it. And he said that they had to sign non-disclosure agreements. He said about that time, I guess the chief or whoever came in and told him, to shut up and you're not going to talk about this. And so that was like the last conversation Patrick ever had until he was out of the Navy of this event.
Yeah.
So I actually had the opportunity in March of this year to get all these guys together and interview them. So another sailor came out via email, Jason Turner, and he told me that he confirmed what these guys were saying on the Princeton, that he had been there in November and he saw the FLIR film, but he saw a different version. So his account is seeing a FLIR film that contained evidence of evasive maneuvers and turns that he said would be impossible for a conventional aircraft to execute. I don't know anyone else that has seen that longer film today, like in public. It hasn't been released. The one we have is like a little under a minute and a half.
Yeah. He
was saying this film was like 5 to 10 minutes in length, and he watched the whole thing.
Let me ask you just a quick question. I don't want to interject, but before we get too far ahead with the Air Force officers coming in and confiscating that data and essentially destroying it and the NDA, the skeptic part of me comes in and says, was this potentially a Air Force piece of technology that they were testing? The Navy guys see it, guys and gals, see it, vector in on it, chase it, see it, document it, and so on, and then the Air Force comes in. What is the consensus overall with not only yourself, who's looked into this so much, but also the military aspect of this in regards to the Navy? Do they feel that potentially this was a test of some kind, or do they rule that out altogether?
I think it's sort of split amongst the Navy veterans that are in the film. When I asked them, they first kind of lean that way. I mean, I think Gary sort of leans, he's like, I think that it could have been ours, or, I know that Patrick Hughes says, hey man, I've seen some stuff that most civilians will never see in their lifetime. It could be something that's ours. But then they also flip to the other side, and they realize that the flight characteristics sort of exceed anything man-made. I mean, when you look at the description of these objects with no, source of obvious propulsion, with no flight control surfaces, executing, G-defying non-Newtonian acceleration and stopping, that would pretty much blow apart any conventional aircraft. They fall back to, wait a second, how could it be a secret drone that's performing in this way? It performs more like a UFO, descriptions of UFOs, not of, secret technology. So I think that they sort of go back and forth, and there's certainly a lot of theories. I mean, we've had discussions about holographic projections and plasma and, all sorts of, we have some type of anti-gravitical technology that has been developed in secret, and that's what we're seeing here. again, we don't have any evidence. It's conjecture, but I mean, I'm going to fall on that side of it before I think that there's some like hyperdimensional alien or something.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would rather it be technology that we've developed, so I don't know though.
You outlined kind of the military discussion behind it and those that were there. When it's all said and done, if you had to put a definitive identification on it, do you have a number one going theory, or do you wrestle with it as well? You personally?
I go back and forth. I mean, there's days when I'm like, yeah, they got something. There's some special access program and they have some tech. And, I mean, when you think about it, if you're doing some operational testing of some high tech, decoy or whatever, it would be the perfect opportunity because you're within range of the homeland. You have a test bed, which would be probably the most powerful carrier strike group that we have, really.
Yeah.
The most advanced aircraft. So if you were going to do an operational test of some tech, it would be a great test bed because, first of all, hey, do you guys have any weapons loaded? No. Okay, good. No one's going to shoot anything down, right? Accidentally. And you go in afterwards and you're like, okay, we want to see what they saw. We want to see what the radar saw. We want to hear what the pilots were saying, what the air controllers were saying, what the radio comms were. It's a great opportunity to get that kind of real world data that maybe it would be similar to what your adversaries would be seeing too in a combat theater of operations. So, I think of that, but then I'm like, wait, how could there be something that's accelerating to 24,000 plus miles an hour and stopping on a dime? Well, it could, then I'm like, there's no way we have that because here we're polluting our environment with fossil fuels and gas combustion turbine jets are flying and polluting the atmosphere with CO2. I mean, really, we have that free, almost like 0 point type anti-gravitic stuff. Yet, on the other hand, we're developing billion-dollar programs to develop conventional fighter jets. It just doesn't seem, it seems incongruous, but again, I don't know.
Before I get into more about the documentation, because I'm very curious about that, and I'm going to admit to everybody, as much as I have wanted to look into this case, honestly, I haven't. I've stayed away from it for no other reason other than the UFO field is so large. There's only so much you can focus on. But before we get there, one last quick question about the incident itself and to your point about the technology. You had said that object had kind of zoomed away at hypersonic speed. Did the witnesses ever explain a sonic boom associated with that?
There was none. There were several descriptions of that. First of all, the 4 air crew that had approached it within a mile and had their eyeballs on it. And you have to remember, there's multi-sensors involved here. A lot of its testimony, we don't have the records of, we don't have the radar tapes, in other words, because I think it's kind of difficult. A lot of that stuff is classified. I mean, the military is not going to hand over capabilities of the radar systems. But when the 4 air crew saw it take off, there was no sonic boom. I mean, that's their testimony. It's go hypersonic. And Kevin on the Princeton, was witnessing these objects. He just said that as the fighter jets, and this is one thing to remember from my story, when they approached at 24,000 feet, they did not see the object. Kevin Day claims that as these fighter jets approached these objects, they dropped from altitude to the surface of the ocean. So here's 2 independent testimonies sort of correlating with each other. No one's really talked about this before, but okay, they're 24,000 on radar. The jets come out, they're not there anymore. Well, Kevin says these objects dropped out of the sky to 50 feet or so, and he says 0.78 seconds. He wrote it down because the next day in the Princeton, they went back to the spy radar data and replayed it, basically looking at this intercept. And he said he wrote down, because this object was at, they tracked it at 24 or 20, whatever, 1,000 feet. In less than 1 second, it was at the surface of the ocean.
Wow.
So there was no sonic booms. He said there would have been, you'll see it in the movie, he says there would have been multiple sonic booms if an object was breaking the sound barrier, like that. So no.
Before I run out of time with you, I do want to talk about the documentation. You briefly mentioned the report that appeared on KLAS's website. That's the affiliate station out of Las Vegas, Nevada, where Mr. George Knapp works. And he had, I believe, is credited. I could be wrong, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's credited for dropping that report first in one of his news stories, which obviously has circulated fairly widely thereafter. But I don't know if that's ever been truly determined, if that is a official government document, or potentially, I think Leslie Kane had said that was a Bigelow Aerospace document. Regardless, the details are fascinating wherever it came from. But where I want to go with you next is from an official level. Obviously, there was a lot going on with this incident, as you've already explained. Have people or yourself gone after, through FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, documents, deck logs, stuff like that, and what, if anything, has been found?
Yeah, so the documents that are on KLAS and to the Stars Academy, I can't verify those, myself. Obviously, they're being presented as factual accounts from the witnesses that were being interviewed in the documents. So again, we haven't seen those documents anywhere else. I myself and a few others began doing FOIA requests. Another researcher, Robert Powell, and myself began doing FOIA requests for all of this stuff. We received the deck logs from the USS Nimitz. We went after the deck logs of the USS Princeton. It had been reported by the witnesses, actually, that USS Chaffee, the destroyers USS Chaffee and Higgins, were on site as well. So we went after those deck logs. What came back was that we have the Nimitz almost the entire month of November. There's really nothing in there. I mean, the deck logs are from the bridge, and it gives information on heading, course, speed of the vessels, very, very scant information. I think that if they had seen anything in the sky, I mean, they would have reported that, but there's nothing, and it doesn't cover the actual squadron operations. It just covers the ship. So we do have that document. It's freely available to anybody that wants it. I can provide that. The Princeton came back, the cruiser that was with Spy 1, Kevin Day. Oh, well, they never provided, the ship never provided any logs. And in discussions with the Navy History Archives, I said, is that unusual? And she said it's very unusual, that they had gone to the Naval Intelligence to see if perhaps they had it. And she said that the only reason usually that a vessel wouldn't submit a log would be that if it was classified, like top secret. And she said that she would find that very unusual for like the Princeton in a training environment like that to have that occur. So that log is missing.
The log for that day or for that month, or did they elaborate on how much was missing?
We were going for the logs for that training period, that evolution. It's my understanding that I think it's the entire year. I mean, I think that we could go back and ask. I'd have to even go look at it. Once I found out that, well, I'm not getting it, but I didn't pursue it further. And then the other two vessels we did get the logs for, and we discovered that they weren't even there, which brings up a point about memory. A lot of these sailors would tell you before I got those FOIAs that, yeah, we were there with the Higgins and Chaffee, which also had Aegis systems, and you should get their logs to see if they had anything. Well, they weren't even there. Higgins was tied up at the pier in San Diego, and Chaffee was out by Hawaii en route. Wow. So they weren't even on site. I tried to get some other documents. I have a couple FOIAs out trying to get the summary of the flights from Fast Eagle, so far, it's been assigned for about a year now.
Yeah.
With Navy, Air Force, Pacific Fleet, sort of. I don't know that I'll ever get a response, but there was a document that was leaked called Event Summary that does appear to be a legitimate flight summary from the Air Wing that describes the event that I talked about with Fast Eagles, and it mentions this unidentified object they witnessed. So.
It's an amazing story with lots of twists and turns. I'm fascinated by those missing deck logs. That to me, I think, is one of the bigger points that we should look at, especially when the naval archivist is telling you, that's really unusual. Because sometimes for me, I don't know about you, but for me, you think some things might be unusual, and then you start asking around to people that know, more than I would, and they go, well, no, that's not necessarily unusual. And you go, well, that burst my bubble. But for the fact that this archivist is telling you, no, this is fairly unusual, I think that there's definitely something there. Now, I've got a couple more minutes left with you. For all of those who want to see Dave's film, definitely do so. His website is www.thenimitzEncounters.com. I will link it all on the show notes page at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. I'll give you specific and direct links to everything that Dave and I have talked about. That way you can take a look at those documents that he referred to, the documentary itself, and so on. But Dave, in the last couple of minutes, I got to ask you, you obviously have a lot of fans out there since you plopped this down on the internet, and with the combination of both renditions of it, definitely a couple million views that your film has garnered. Let me ask you, is there another one in the works? Not to put you on the spot.
Well, the stuff with the USS Roosevelt in 2015 off the east coast of the United States, off the coast of Virginia and Florida, has been a long-going little bit of research me and some of my colleagues have been doing, and I'll tell you, it's fascinating. We actually figured out the detailed information that kind of was associated with the other two FLIR videos released by the New York Times and To the Stars, one called Gimbal, one called Go Fast. And they were associated with this event that occurred in 2015 off the coast of the United States. It's my understanding that the History Channel show is going to interview these aviators that film those or know the guys that film those two videos and talk much more about those encounters. The little previews that they have released describe some of the objects as a spinning top, or I guess it would be like a cube inside of a sphere, that they actually had visuals on. These aviators also said that they were unable to get visuals on some of these things. Once they had upgraded the radar systems, the ASA radar systems in the fighters, they were getting some really good radar locks on these unknowns. And when they would approach them within visual range, they didn't see them with their eyes, which is also intriguing. So I don't know. I mean, the Roosevelt Encounters, it sort of has a nice ring to it, I'm not sure.
So next week, maybe you'll have that movie done for us all?
That's right. Hey, I already have a few fighter jet models, so...
That's awesome. Well, I do look forward, if you do decide to make it, when the Roosevelt Encounters comes out. Now, my last question for you, and again, not to put you on the spot, but you had mentioned to me before we started recording that you were talking about making a military police and pilots group that you want to start. Do you mind if I ask you a little bit about what you want to do with that?
Yeah. Right. Well, as I get a lot of emails coming in, because in the film I say, if you have had any experience, send me an email. I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of responses, and my personal experience with some of these vets that have pretty much been networking with each other has been entirely very positive, because I think that it's difficult to talk about this subject matter, and normally no one wants to hear it, including their family, and people don't believe them. They just think it's like a story or something. So being able to talk to other witnesses has been very beneficial for these guys. They've all told me it's really helped them. immensely, and I was surprised by that. There's a retired police officer that I'm sort of working with, Timothy McMillan. You know Tim.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of encouraged me. He said, look, why don't you formalize a group and start thinking of how we can bring some of these witnesses together, not necessarily just to report their sightings, but to help each other. I don't know that there's anything out there like that would allow them to feel comfortable talking to other, military law enforcement officers and pilots about these things. Where that leads, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's just sort of in its inception right now. I'm thinking maybe like some type of nonprofit that has a mission, so I hope that develops,
Yeah, well, it seems like the aura around the UFO phenomena, even though it is very controversial in many aspects, there's seemingly is a shift in the way that the general public is viewing it, which is a good thing. So a group like that, I think, would be incredibly beneficial, especially with the caliber of witnesses that you would want to bring together. So, hey, my open offer to help you or bring awareness to it always stands. So if you need anything, please definitely let me know. Again, check out Dave's film. It is worth watching. www.thenimitzEncounters.com. Dave, thank you so incredibly much for your time and letting us in on how you made this film, but also about the story itself. It's definitely been very educational for me, and I'm sure the audience as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you letting me talk about it. I mean, my wife says I'm obsessed with it, enough already, but I mean, I never get tired of talking about it. And all my friends on social media, we do kind of spend a lot of time talking about it. And, I think that it is very inspiring. And so this film is sort of an offshoot of that.
Well, very good. Yeah, and my wife fires that accusation my way quite a few times as well. So I'm with you. All right. Thanks, Dave. Thanks for joining us.
Got it.
And thank you all for listening. This is John Greenewald Jr. signing off. We'll see you next time.